Hello, everybody. Sorry for a little bit of a late start. We had some technical difficulties that we needed to figure out. Hello, I am Christiana Limniatis, Director of Preservation Services for Preservation Buffalo and Niagara. And thank you for joining us on this first night of Modern WNY, our annual celebration of all things modern. Tonight, as you know, because you registered and it says on the screen in front of you, we're going to go through the ABCs of Modernism. So just a nice fun going through the alphabet, talking about different key buildings, techniques, architects, designers, anything related to modernism. It's not going to just focus on Western New York. It's going to be kind of national and international names and figures and buildings. So just kind of a nice little overview of some key things about modernism. Today I have with me Tia, my coworker. She is going to be our moderator and kind of voice of God with the questions. So we're going to have a set time kind of in the middle of the presentation to stop and have a break for some questions, and then again at the end. So I hope that you have questions that pop up as we go through these things. If you want me to answer those questions, make sure to use that Q&A button, the Q&A function. There is also the chat, and I'm sure that Tia will be sharing some fun things in there because she is usually quite good about those things. The only other thing I wanted to say is that I know that there's going to be a thunderstorm coming through, and I don't know why, but I've been having a weird feeling about the electricity. So if there is a power outage, I apologize in advance. All right, let's get started. Before we do get to our ABCs of Modernism, for those of you who are new to Preservation Buffalo Niagara, we are your local preservation advocacy organization. We are the region's only full service, professionally staffed historic preservation organization with our mission to identify, protect, and promote our unique architecture and historic legacy, and to connect people to the places they love in Western New York. I say Western New York because while our name has Buffalo and Niagara in it, we actually provide services to the 5 westernmost counties of New York State. So while our offices are here in the city of Buffalo, we are available to assist on any types of preservation projects across those 5 counties. I'm contractually obligated to thank our sponsors for tonight. Thank you to Erie County, who provides funding to support our educational programming, and then certainly our preservation of PBN membership. While we can go to funders like Erie County and other organizations to fund very specific aspects of our work and specific projects, the vast majority of our day-to-day work, the actual boots on the ground trying to save and rehabilitate properties, is done through and supported through our membership dollars and donations. You can't really write a grant to stop a demolition. So having that type of support is absolutely critical to our work. Many of you made a donation when you registered tonight. Thank you so very much. It's through funders like Erie County that we're able to try to keep our programming free or very low cost. And again, through your continued support of those types of programs, really make sure that we can have this be accessible to everyone. If you are not a member of PBN and you have fun tonight, you learned something new tonight, I strongly encourage you to head over to our website and explore the different ways that you can support us. And with that, okay, one more thing before we move on to the letters. Again, first night of Modern WNY 2021. Again, this is our only lecture as part of the week this year. We have our 2 self-guided tours. We have our annual Drive Yourself Mod with a new set of 14 modernist landmarks from across our region that you can go and enjoy. We also have A Modern Man, the work of Robert T. Coles, which highlights the work of Robert T. Coles, famed local architect. And then we are having 2 walking tours. This week, we're going to be in Delaware Acres, which is the former name for the neighborhood directly north of Delaware Park in the city of Buffalo. And then this weekend, we're going to head up to Niagara Falls, hopefully weather permitting, and walk around and tour some of the modern buildings that remain and talk about some of them that have been lost in downtown Niagara Falls. So I hope to see you guys at one of those events as well. And head over to that website, which I'm sure is what Tia is typing into the chat, so you guys can go see and take advantage of or participate in all of these programs. All right, let us get to the alphabet. A is for Art Deco and Art Modern. Now, technically, Art Deco and Art Modern aren't necessarily part of modernism. I think that everyone's definition of what modernism is kind of varies with a start time, but we're usually talking about World War II era or right before World War II and heading into the present. And Art Deco and Art Modern are definitely come before that time period, but it is that architectural style that's on the cusp of, you know, classical traditional type of architectural styles, and then what becomes modernism and how modernism evolves and grows. With Art Deco, which kind of evolves first in the early teens and 20s, and Buffalo City Hall is definitely a wonderful example of that. Art Deco kind of dips its toe into modernity. It's still using classical and traditional architectural, you know, themes and processes and forms to help in building these and designing these buildings. But as far as decorative elements of those Art Deco buildings, they're not also trying to use those same classical and traditional decorative elements. They're expanding and looking to use more of geometry, looking to use more of the elements and designs and spirit that is, you know, the 19-teens and 1920s. They're looking to a more modern inspiration for those architectural detailings. There's also a step and incorporation of inspiration from indigenous architecture, whether it's Native American architecture here in America or some Mesoamerican and South American elements and design influence, but using that as kind of the precursor to help create this new version of what American architecture is going to be, at least here in America. So Art Deco kind of dips the toe into being modern. And then Art Modern, which evolves kind of out of that, is really kind of looking towards the sleek and streamlined modernity of the 1930s, that industrial designs used for, you know, cars and airplanes and boats, and incorporating that into these buildings so that our buildings can be as modern and fast and sleek as these you know, machines that we're building. And again, that is kind of the beginning of modernism. Modernism is all about, you know, that architecture should reflect the spirit of the modern age. Not just in its machinery and all of that, but also with the ethic and the moral obligation to move forward and to progress, to kind of create buildings that responded to the world around it. So that is Art Deco and Art Modern for letter A. Let's go on to letter B. B is for Gordon Bunshaft. He was the lead designer of the Lever House, which is this greenish tinged glass skyscraper up here in the corner. It's in New York City. It was the headquarters of the Lever soap company, now Unilever company. It's no longer occupied by them, I believe, but that is that company. He won, he's an award-winning architect. He won the Pritzker Prize. And he really was responsible for ushering in a new era of modernist skyscrapers and design and corporate architecture. He was a very stern figure. I found a quote in a book that people had described him as a titan of industry, a decisive army general, and architectural John Wayne. So he took his architecture quite seriously. And because of that, in a way, I guess, is led him to be a head partner, you know, partner and lead designer for the famed architectural firm SOM, which started out as Skidmore, Owens and Merrill. That firm was kind of the powerhouse of mid-century architecture and design. It's still active today. It's one of the largest, you know, a global architectural and urban planning engineering firm today. And he was the lead designer for many years. What is another thing that is great about Gordon Bunshaft? He is from Buffalo. He was born here in 1909. He went to Lafayette High School. He left to go to school and learn architecture at MIT, and then went on to all of his amazing work that he did at SOM, but he did come back to Buffalo. He did still care about Buffalo. And so we see that in the most dramatic way by his addition to the Albright Knox. The Albright Knox Art Gallery, originally built by E.B. Green in the early 19-teens. By the 1950s, they recognized that they needed an addition. They needed additional space, and the old original building needed some upgrades. And so they had went out and found some architects and tried to create plans for an addition, and that failed miserably in the public. The original plan was to create one-story kind of long addition on the Delaware Park side of the building, and that was just wholeheartedly vetoed by the community. So they went back to the drawing board and had another call for designs and a call for architects to work on the project. And Bunshaft was selected, and his final plan was released to the public in 1960. And the result is that box edition that we so love of the Albright Knox. It is going to be altered soon when the Albright Knox new edition is completed. There is going to be a very amazing architectural sculpture that's going to be added to the top of that building. So it will be slightly altered in the near future. Yeah, that's what I got to say about that. Sorry. And so just one last thing to talk about SOM, the firm that he worked at for so long. Again, Skidmore, Owens, Merrill. It's really important to kind of remember that name. There's a couple other titles and letters that we're going to cover coming up that then tie back to SOM. It really was this linchpin firm in those 1950s, 1960s time period where all of these really substantial and genre defining buildings are coming out of this firm and a couple of other ones. So that is B for Gordon Bunshaft. Next, C for cantilevered projections. So, it doesn't seem like something very spectacular or important. I think now, especially, being in the 2021, we have lots of buildings that have very interesting angles and hanging walls and lots of crazy things that are being able to be done with buildings these days that wouldn't have been able to be done maybe 50 or 40 years ago. And that's how cantilever projections were. If not for the advancement of steel construction, of concrete construction, we wouldn't have the ability to have very large projections hanging over buildings. I mean, a cantilever, the technical definition is a beam or a platform or some part of a structure, even a staircase that is only supported on one end. The most famous example of a cantilever projection, the most recognizable example of using this aspect is in architect Pierre Koenig's case study house number 22, which is that black and white photograph on the left-hand side. It's also known as the Stahl house. It was unlike anything constructed at the time. Originally, the gentleman, Mr. Stahl, Buck Stahl, who commissioned the house, he had previously been rejected by one or two other architects because they just couldn't figure out how to build a house on this steep cliff overlooking Los Angeles, overlooking Hollywood, that he wanted to build this house on. And so it was Koenig who had this vision and this idea to be able to use this cantilever projection to be able to best use and fully use the entire site. It again was called the case study house because it was built out of the Case Study Houses program, which was something that was sponsored by the Art and Architecture magazine, where they went out and found, major architects, up and coming architects, to design and build, inexpensive, efficient model homes that were also artfully designed. We're going to talk about it in a couple of letters about the housing, the housing crisis after the war and this need to create and design inefficient, prefab or other types of, quick housing. And so this program, the Case Study House, wanted to follow suit with that and be able to create these cheaper, quick to build houses, but also having them be artfully designed. And so they asked all of these different architects to be a part of the program, design their own case house. And then some of them actually did get built, this being one of them. And then it was immortalized in this legendary photograph by Julius Schulman. You see all over the internet and tons of books how it's usually called, this photograph is referred to as like the most photographed house. It's been featured in so many different movies. I can't even start to list them, and TV shows and things. It's constantly being used in like fashion photo shoots and stuff. And it's said to be the most photographed building in the world. Don't know how about that, but it is very, very significant. Peter Koenig, the architect of this, was one of the most recognizable names in California modernism, which is good to know. And the program that this building was built out of ran from about 1945 to about 1966 on and off. And again, there were a lot of houses that were designed out of it, but very few of them were actually constructed. And the ones that were constructed were primarily in the Los Angeles area. There's also another picture on the right-hand side, which is just another type of cantilevered house, and just showing how, it's not just about using that cantilevered technology and the ability so that you can build in places that before you might not have been able to build in, or that you would have to excavate so much more to be able to build in. But this kind of aspect and this characteristic was incorporated into regular houses as well. So you have this kind of just, a normal-ish house in a regular neighborhood, not up high in the hills of Hollywood. And it's using that cantilever projection in place of a garage, a more traditional looking garage. So, from high society types buildings all the way to regular neighborhood buildings, you definitely see the use of cantilever projections in many, many different types of individual architectural styles that make up modernism. Next, D is for Jane Drew. Jane Drew is someone that you've probably never heard of, and that's bad. Jane Drew is incredibly significant. She's one of those unsung heroes, kind of the behind the scenes types people that helped really shape modernism into what we now know, and has participated in those big, huge, major, famous kind of projects. But because she worked with men who were more important or thought of as more important than her, more headline names, she has been kind of forgotten and left out of a lot of those conversations, but she was a part of really some important work. She's a British designer. Again, she was a pioneer for modern movement in England, along with her husband, Maxwell Fry. The two of them worked with Le Corbusier to design Shanglihar. Shanglihar was a planned city as the new capital for the Punjabi district in India after India got its independence from England. And so it's this massively important planned city that I highly recommend you go out and read and research more about. We could not talk about all of the aspects of how important this city is, but Jane, her husband, and Le Corbusier, those were the three that were the head designers and planners for that whole entire city. Again, she kind of gets sucked aside in those narratives about that city because Le Corbusier is such a name, so he gets all the attention, but she is definitely right there along with him and responsible, especially for a lot of the regular housing that went into this planned city. Again, after India got its independence, they went on a massive building campaign to build this new India and to fill these government buildings and to fill the needs of the Indian people of the nation. And so they created this planned capital. And so they designed everything from the government buildings to the layout of the streets down to individual neighborhoods. This picture on the left-hand side is a picture of one of those streets that Jane was definitely instrumental in the design of those individual buildings and the layout of everything. Why she was instrumental in that point of view is that she was not just a trained architect, but she was also a town planner. Her whole ethos is really described as an anthropological approach to architecture and planning. She thought that the way to create successful designs was through rigorous research to ensure that the buildings worked in a practical way. Yes, she wanted to design beautiful, beautiful things that would get her to be famous or whatever, but she also understood that didn't matter if the building wasn't actually usable and fit into the actual people's lives of the people who are going to occupy that space. That kind of seems like a duh thing today. Most good architects and planners are actually taking into account how people use those spaces so they can design them better. But at this time period, that wasn't a common thing. Architects had their vision. They wanted the building to look this way. They wanted the rooms to be this way. And they, stereotypically didn't want the input of regular old people. And so that was sort of revolutionary for Jane at the time. So in addition to working in India, before she got to India with Le Corbusier, she actually started her own firm after she finished college, finished her architecture studies. It was the first entirely female architecture firm in London, in England, and they drew a number of large projects throughout the city, and then eventually became a partnership with her husband. And then she did a lot of projects in West Africa. She was really focused and dedicated to trying to provide quality, affordable housing in parts of West Africa. And it was that work that got her attention of the Indian prime ministers and leaders, and that they invited her to come to India to plan this city. So they had first asked her to do it. But then in thinking about it more, she realized that this was way more daunting than I could be in charge of, that this needs to be more of a team approach with more people, that it was, she was biting off more than she could chew per chance. And so that's why she went to Le Corbusier and invited him to be a part of the project. So again, that's why it's a little bit frustrating how she kind of doesn't get the dues that she should get for that project when it was actually going to be hers originally, and she invited Le Corbusier to be a part of it. There is a podcast that I love. It's called 99%, and they have a really fabulous episode on Janglohar and all of the work they did there. And I highly recommend listening to that. So that is D for Jane Drew. Oh, and that's her in the corner with her husband looking at a building. She was pretty, she had a lot of balls, I have to say. She was like a no nonsense lady. I saw a lot of pictures of her where she's just like chain smoking cigarettes. So I don't know, I think I would be her friend. I like her. All right, so E is for Charles and Ray Eames. They are, I think everyone pretty much in this room probably knows the name, knows who they are. They are an American married couple of industrial designers who made significant contributions in art and design, not just in architecture, but in furniture design as well. Graphic design, fine arts. Charles was the public face of the Eames office, but Ray and Charles worked together in the creative process and employed an entire staff to help them execute their vision. Charles studied architecture, but was kicked out of his program because he was a supporter of Frank Lloyd Wright. And that was at a time when Frank Lloyd Wright was controversial. And so he was kicked out of his architecture program. Eventually he, continues his studies, opens his own firm, and heads the design department at Cranbrook Academy of Art. That is a private art institution, a college in Michigan. It is a pretty influential institution. Several of the people we're going to talk about tonight actually are associated with that institution. So it is one of those centers around the world that did kind of put different professionals together that helped create what we now know as modernism, I think. So, Charles is there, heading the department, the design department, and then Ray comes in, eventually landing at the same school as well. That's where they meet and they get married, and then they move to California, and together they pioneer this method of molding plywood, and they get the attention of the Navy. And this is, during the war. And so the Navy commissioned them to produce molded plywood splints and stretchers and things of that nature. And that kind of continues and expands, and they continue playing around with that technology, and they develop the Eames chair, which is that wood chair that you see on the left-hand side. And that kind of just goes crazy. Everyone's obsessed with it. It's called the chair of the century. They also designed that lounge chair that you see on the bottom of the picture, the Eames lounge chair and an ottoman. Again, quintessentially mid-century pieces of furniture. Fraser had one, so obviously it's awesome. In the middle here, that is their house. It's called the Eames house. It's also known as case study house number 8, because they too were in that case study house program that Art and Architecture magazine operated. And so instead of selling or trying to have their design as a commission for someone else, they built it as their home and studio. They finished the building in 1949. They moved in on Christmas Eve, and then they never left. They both passed away, Charles in 1978 and Ray in 1988. They died. Their children, their daughter took on the house, and it is now the home of the foundation that celebrates their work and lives. It is been designated not just on the National Register, and it operates as a historic house museum, but it is a National Historic Landmark. National Historic Landmark status is reserved for those resources in the country that are, exemplar to the national history. So this is the top gold star that a landmark can get, and the Eames House has that. So that is E for Eames. F for futurism. Futurism is one of my favorites for a silly reason, and I'll tell you that in a second. All right, so futurist architecture is an early 20th century form of architecture that was born in Italy. It was characterized by long dramatic lines, suggesting speed and motion and urgency and lyricism even to it, the art of this modern world, of this modern technology. It starts off as an artistic movement with, poets and people of that kind of realm, all types of artists. And then it kind of has this splinter group off of it that kind of takes that love of the possibility of the future and turns it into kind of this cult of the machine age, and focuses on the kind of more negative things of the future, the war and the violence aspect of it, that we have to fight for the future in a way, or something kind of like that. And many of those mostly men that were participating in that kind of splinter off group of futurism actually end up dying in World War I because they were so committed to the future in this cult of the machine that they all volunteered to fight in the war. One of those individuals is Antonio Santielli, not very good at Italian pronunciation, I'm sorry. His drawing is that one on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side. It's called La Città Nuova, like the new city. He drew it in 1914. He died just 2 years later in a battle of World War I. And so that is that first kind of era of futurism. Then it's kind of just hanging out. No one's really doing anything with futurism, not dramatic ways. And then it kind of has a revival in the 60s and 70s, again, to highlight this new era of machine and motion. And then when we get into the 20th century and now into the 21st century, futurism, instead of focusing on the machine only and this kind of stylized vision of what the future is going to be, now neo-futurism kind of focuses on, yes, the innovation and machines potential that the future has, but adding kind of this ethical aspect to it, this utopian aspect to it. How do we create utopian architecture for the future? How do we match the machine with humanity? And so that's where we have on the left-hand side the Tour de Montreal, which was built in Montreal by Roger Talbot in 1987, an example of neo-futurism. The reason why I love futurism is that it is, the original futurism, this picture on the right-hand side that Antonio drew. It is the direct influence of pieces of entertainment, movies and art in the 1920s, like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, right? If you watch Metropolis and you look at Antonio's paintings and drawings, you can see 100% how that era of futurism influenced and kind of set the stage for this beginning era of the skyscraper and this accelerated modern age that we were living in, entering. And then it also directly influenced the magical movie Blade Runner. There are actually, particular scenes of Blade Runner that if you pause quick on the TV, it's almost like they copied some of Antonio's drawings as the backdrop paintings. I had an architecture class in grad school, and my professor was very serious and about the fact that you couldn't learn architecture without learning about the culture it influenced and that influenced it. So with every era of architecture, we always watched a movie to kind of get the feel for what that architecture, what the mood of, what the vibe of that era was, so we could understand what the architecture was. And when we talked about futurism, we watched Blade Runner. Greatest 2 hours of my class ever. So that is F for futurism. G is for Googie. Googie is a very, very fun little subset of kind of an offshoot of futurism, right? We don't have many examples here in the Northeast, especially here in Western New York, mainly I think because of weather situations, of the snow. You mainly see Googie in California, in warmer weather states, but definitely California. It is just a type of futurist architecture that's influenced by car culture and jets and the space age and the atomic era, and kind of just this kitschy, it kind of definitely evolves more kitschy as time goes on into just these bright, explosive, fun designs. You see here this car wash with the rainbow, pennants or banners. I'm not sure exactly how to describe those things. All of the letters separated out instead of one big boring sign. You have, that typical drive-in architecture, the signs along the road to grab your attention, to get you to come to this drive-in, the lights, the flash. One of the lonely examples of Googie here in Western New York is that gas station on the bottom, that Stop and Gas. It's on Lake Avenue in Lockport. It was featured in our 2019 Drive Yourself Mod brochure, which you can buy on our website if you would like to get one. Again, Googie themed architecture was popular among motels, coffee houses, gas stations, things along the road to get your attention. The style later became widely known and incorporated into mid-century modern styles. The little individual aspects of these you definitely see, especially here that drive-in, you see how those letters are formed and the little starbursts and just the general aesthetic of that sign. You definitely see those types of design elements being introduced into other architectural styles that are developing later on during the modernist era. And then it's also sometimes called, again, in California, where there's so many more examples of these, where they can divide them into subsets and it becomes other types. Over time, it becomes other styles as well. So in Southern California, it definitely evolves into something that's called populux. And it's also sometimes called doo-wop. But yeah, Googie is just goofy, fun, roadside, bright stuff. And that is G for Googie. Next, H is, and again, keep putting questions. I can see that something's happening in the chat, but any questions, put it in the Q&A. We're gonna have like a question portion later on. All right, H is for hyperbolic, parabolic arches. So a hyperbolic, parabolic, I can't say any words today. Anyway, they're sometimes called, just referred to as H/P. They are a doubly curved surface, right? So they resemble saddles or Pringle chips, how it has that double curve. So you have one side that is a convex form on one axis, and on the other axis, it's a concave form. So you have one that's going up and one that's going down always. The first kind of house to really showcase this type of roof structure was the Eduardo Catalano house that was built in 1954 in Raleigh, North Carolina by Eduardo Catalano. He was an up-and-coming Argentinian architect. The design was highly publicized in that early 50s. It was called the House of the Decade by the House and Home magazine. And it was later became an icon of kind of that mid-century optimism of it, the excitement of architecture and the excitement that modernism brought. It was one of the few buildings that Frank Lloyd Wright has praised during his career. He wasn't known for giving other people credit for good things. He liked to take all of the credit, but this was one building he spoke of that he enjoyed and saw something new and fresh in that design. The roof was warped. It's made out of wood, that big, huge sloped roof here on the top. And so it has kind of a shoehorn shape to it, with two corners of the roof firmly anchored to the ground, and then the other two pointed upwards. So it allowed, because of that change in roof shape, you not only allowed, variety of size of space on the interior, but you could allow some more grand open spaces, but also have some spaces that were smaller and confined and more private. And then sadly, that house has been demolished since. So this is an archival colored, I think it's colorized picture right there. So unfortunately, it has been demolished. And then right on the bottom, that is the Abbey of St. Mary in St. Louis. That is in the Catholic English Benedictine congregation in Missouri. It was designed by master architect Gio Obata. And it's considered one of, like, I saw it on many lists that listed as like the hidden architectural gems that America doesn't know about. So it has its distinctive flower shape as reinforced concrete shell, and it's was devised by the famed engineering firm Weldingler Associates. And it's comprised of three symmetrical tiers of whitewashed concrete arches filled with translucent fiberglass material known as colwall. And it was built in 1962. So, these are two kind of extremes of how these arches can work, but certainly, again, whether it's high style buildings to just regular everyday neighborhood houses, you definitely see a lot of parabolic arches, concave arches, like parabolic arches on buildings. My most favorite one here in the city of Buffalo is the doesn't have a name. It's an apartment building on Delaware Avenue across from the Catholic school, across from pretty much from Blessed Sacrament Church. It's this teal colored 1950s, 60s, beautiful apartment building with this grand arched, I think maybe somebody is probably saying in the comments what building that is. I think that Lorna's here tonight and she lives in that building. And so again, this idea of these parabolic arches, these grand concrete arches that are kind of a model, only made possible through this reinforced concrete is definitely something you see often in modernist buildings. That is H. That is H is for high. There we go. I'm done talking about that. Let's move on to I is for international style. So international style has a lot of similarity with the early modern styles, the Art Deco and Art Modern that we talked about before. But the big difference between those styles and international style is that those styles still used, for the most part, had masonry forms, masonry structures to it, where international style started with the idea that they were going to be built with lightweight skeleton, structural skeleton, so steel framing, metal framing. Art Deco, depending on the year that the Art Deco building is built, they might definitely have steel in them, but it's still kind of that emphasis on using the stone on the exterior, where international style is using that metal skeleton framing and then using other types of material on the outside. It doesn't necessarily have to have this grounding in masonry elements, in brick or stone. It can be, veneer type material, glass and metal. In the 1930s and 40s, international style spread from its base in Germany and France to North and South America and to Scandinavia, Britain, and Japan. The clean, efficient geometric qualities of the style came to form the basis of architectural vocabulary of the skyscraper in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. So it is, these are residential examples that you see here on your screen. But if we go back in our brains to the Bunshaft, to his Lever house, that green skyscraper, that is the quintessential international style skyscraper. You have glass, metal, it's just the elongated tall building version of these residential homes. So again, the international style provided an aesthetic rationale for the stripped down, clean surface skyscrapers that become the status symbol for American corporate power and progressiveness at the time. The its origins are tied to the 1932 MoMA show, Modern Architecture International exhibition, which also had an accompanying book. the book called The International Style, where Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson identified 3 principles of early international style. So architecture as volume, regularity, and avoiding the application of ornaments. So international style is going to have all just clean lines of these materials. The first, after that show in 1932, the next major milestone for international style is Albert Fry's 1934 home for Dr. Jacob John Cochler, which is this black and white photograph up here. It's built in Palm Springs. Alfred Frey is a Swiss architect who, did some stuff with Corbusier over in Europe. He gets a recommendation, how he gets to America is that Corbusier sets him up with a job with A. Lawrence Cocker, who is the editor of Architectural Record, the magazine. And then this is his brother. And so Albert Frey builds this house for his doctor brother. So again, kind of this first major example of international style for residential. And then certainly at the bottom, kind of the major example is Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House in Illinois, built in 1945 to 1951, all glass and metal. It's another building that's considered a National Historic Landmark, again, the highest designation that something can have in the United States, and it has earned that distinction. Less is more with international style. All right, next is J for James H. Johnson. James H. Johnson is Rochester's most imaginative mid-20th century architect. He is best known for the Mushroom House, which is him standing in front of the Mushroom House in Parrington, New York. He also designed St. John the Evangelist Church in Greece, New York. Over the course of his 60-year career in Rochester, he designed more than 400 projects. While he was that prolific in his designs, only about a handful ever reached the public realm. And the buildings that remain of his are mostly either these large, very dramatic private residences or his churches. There's several churches and religious institutions that he's designed. So the Mushroom House, before I talk about the Mushroom House, another aspect of his practice and something that he was very well known for was that he really looked to integrate architecture with other art forms. And so he recognized that while I might build this building and have this vision for the building, my vision is going to be improved by partnering with other artists. And so in his buildings, you see this integration of a lot of glass artists and other types of skilled craftspeople to kind of influence and further expand and direct his vision with the building. So he really was very good at partnering with other artists. So that's a credit to him. All right, so let's talk about the Mushroom House. It is officially called the Antel Whitman House. And it's made by poured concrete it's a concrete polyurethane that is used to make that. And how that was created was that on site there, they actually dug the holes into the ground and poured that concrete. So they created the molds for those pieces there and then elevated those and put them on those spikes, on those spears to create that structure. While we call it the Mushroom House because it has that brownish color to it, so they kind of look like mushrooms. It's actually built, inspired by Queen Anne's lace, that white flower that has that umbrella head to it. So it's just kind of funny how we kind of see it as this fungus looking thing, but it was actually inspired by a very regal, beautiful white flower. Another building of his on the left-hand side is St. John the Baptist Church in Lockport. You probably saw it on our Instagram several times. It is featured in this year's Drive Yourself mod tour from when it's viewed from above. The large sweeping neo-expressionist church is loosely shaped like a flying dove. And again, you can see here, it's not just his vision when it comes to the building itself, but he worked with a lot of really great glass artists to not only create what the church needed for the imagery that those windows need to include, but to make sure and that it meshed with his design, and then he, you know, inspired by their art. So it was sort of a collaborative thing with those windows. And the other thing that he designed that people are probably familiar with is the Liberty Pole right in the middle of downtown Rochester. That is also his vision. He won the call to build that element. And so that is James H. Johnson. I don't know if Tia has the link for this, but there is a YouTube video out there. The reason we know so much about James H. Johnson is because the architecture firm Barrow, that's based out of Rochester, recently completed a survey of all of his work, a survey and inventory. And so they, since the pandemic started, have been doing some lectures and outreach on that work to educate the community about James Johnson and all of his work. And so I know that they did a lecture for the public library, and I know that that's available on the internet. So if you just Google Barrow, B-E-R-O, and James Johnson, I'm sure that you'll be able to find it. It's really, really interesting and opportunity to learn even more about him. All right, K is for Louis Kahn. Louis Kahn was an American architect based in Philadelphia. He worked in various capacities for several different firms before forming his own shop in 1935. He had his private practice, but he also continued working as a design critic and professor of architecture at the Yale School of Architecture in the late 40s into the 50s. And then from the mid 50s until his death in the 70s, he was a professor of architecture at the School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. He created a a style that was very monumental, very monolithic. He was known, so even though these buildings were very, you know, massive, monumental architecture, they also very kind of innately and delicately in a way responded to human scale. So again, there might be these massive piles of concrete or other types of material, but they did kind of relate to the human and allowed this kind of relationship between that. He was really concerned, especially on the interior, with creating strong formal distinctions between served spaces and servant spaces. But servant spaces doesn't mean like actual places where servants were going to be. It was, you know, the stairwell, the hallway, those kind of secondary spaces, and kind of making sure that those we need them, we have them, but that they have their own type of function and design, and to be able to have these more formal spaces, you know, stay in line with that monumentality that he loved to design in. His palette of materials tended towards heavy textured brick and bare concrete. The texture is often reinforced by the juxtaposition of highly refined surfaces, such as Tarentine marble and stuff. So combining those harsh concrete and other masonry materials with fine pieces of marble and glass. The top building that you see on the right-hand side is the Kimball Art Museum with the arches. And it's in Fort Worth, Texas. It hosts an art collection as well as traveling art exhibits. And it is the private collection of Kay and Velma Kimball. It's a very famous art museum. And it's, you know, usually recognized as one of the most significant architecture, you know, pieces of architecture of this time. Those vaulted ceilings, again, a really great example of this very monumental, heavy building, but built at a human scale. The building below it is the Arts United Center in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I actually don't think that that's what that building is. I think I wrote down the wrong thing. I think that that building that you see on the bottom is actually in Europe, and we'll just have a mystery of what that building is until someone wants to Google it and check, but I actually think I labeled it wrong. The building I do know is the one on the left-hand side with the circle in the middle of it. That is the library at Philip Exeter Academy in New Hampshire. It's just a private school in New Hampshire. They hired him to build a library. The project was simple. The library users were invited to select a book and then go to the window to read in the natural light. That was the entire concept of the library. So based on that idea, the building is divided into 3 layers. At the center is a large entrance, and and when you enter, you encounter all of these books right when you come in. They're housed within what Kahn called the concrete donut. So it protects them from sunlight in that area. So then you can then take those books from the center protected in the concrete donut and go to the outer edges and be able to read in the natural light. So it includes 200 naturally lit library corrals so that you can go and read and enjoy that natural light. He was, his work was definitely infused with international style. Sometimes he's called a precursor for brutalism, but I don't agree with that. I think that's not a great description. And that's all I got for that one. That's Louis Kahn. Sorry. K for Louis Kahn. Let's move on to L. JK. Did I do a J? Yes, I did. JKL. There we go. L is for Lily Reich. Here is another person that you've probably never heard of, and you most definitely should have heard of. We should know her name. So Mies van der Rohe, famous modernist, in that pantheon of the fathers of modernism, he is up there. Less is more is his whole thing, international style, wanting to take out all of the unnecessary detailings that previous generations use and just have that form, function, that simple building. That is Mies. He was not particularly known for wanting to partner people or ask people for their opinion, but the one person that he would ask opinion and advice from is Lily Reich. They partnered together for nearly 20 years. Some of Mies's most prominent and famous pieces of work were done alongside Lily. And for a couple other reasons, Lily is very influential into why we still have Mies documents and we know so much about him. It's because of her. And so she is quite important. She was born in 1885 in Berlin. She trained as an industrial embroiderer because that was something that as a woman she could get into. I think that she did definitely want to be a designer and to go that route, but that wasn't something that was open to her. Once she got into the industrial embroidery, she did kind of move more into fashion and furniture design, and eventually joining this thing that was called the Deutsche Werkbund. It was an organization founded in 1907 that was meant to kind of, highlight the ingenuity of art and artists and design in Germany, and to improve German-made products. Kind of a nationalistic thing to align shopkeepers and that side of the business with the actual designers and artisans that are creating these things. They had lectures and exhibits to show the good stuff coming out of Germany and to encourage continued good design. In 1920, she was elected to the board of directors. She was the first woman to be elected to the board of directors for that. And then her responsibility in that capacity was to put on exhibits. And so she was able to successfully get 2 exhibitions together in 1921 to 1922 at the Newark Museum in New Jersey. She put together the first exhibit, which was titled The Applied Arts. It consisted entirely of women's clothing and accessories, and it sought to promote the revival of German fashion and increase cooperation between artisans and manufacturers. Then the second exhibition was an enormous undertaking with a display of nearly 1,600 objects, mostly chosen by Lily herself, again, to showcase the quality and breadth of German industrial design. Over 4,000 people visited the exhibition that happened from April to May of 1922. And the Newark Museum actually acquired a good number, over 65 objects from that exhibition as part of their permanent collection. There had been plans to have that be a traveling show, but because of World War I and anti-German sentiments in the nation, they just weren't able to take the show on the road. And so Lily returned back to Germany. When she got back to Germany, that's when she met Mies van der Rohe, when she moved to Frankfurt. In 1928, the duo was appointed the artistic directors for the German pavilion at the Barcelona World Exposition. And that is the building that you see on the left. It's quite a difficult building to design. So it's just like a snippet here you see in this photograph. It is considered one of the most defining works of modernism. It is one, in Mies's obituary, this is, the first building mentioned. It is incredibly important to modernism, to international style, to how modern, influencing an entire generation of designers. And it is almost always credited to him solely, but it was them together that worked on this, not just on the architecture and the outside, the physical designs of the building, but also the interior spaces and the furniture. And so you can see that those two chairs that are up on top, those are, what did he call them? They have fancy names. Of course, now I can't see them in my notes, but those are chairs that, Mies designed the form, the outline of, and then Lily is the one that created the fabric for it. The original, that metal chair, the bro chair, is that what it's called? What happened to my notes, people? Anyway, that chair, she actually wove that, the first one that they made, she wove that wicker, that pattern into there. So again, they were a partnership for 12, almost 20 years on these designs together. After they worked on the Barcelona pavilion, Mies appointed her director of building and finishing at the Bauhaus School, where he was in charge. But her time at Bauhaus was cut short because they were shut down in 1933 by the Nazis. She, did some other things with him over the next couple of years, but then he left for America. He escaped Nazis in 1937. She did not go to America. Most of her male colleagues escaped, and she did not. She stayed there. Staying behind in Berlin, she was still kind of in charge of managing Mies's affairs. And it was because of her, she personally saved about 4,000 of his drawings from being destroyed during the bombings by smuggling his work out of Berlin and hiding it in a barn out in the country. So again, Lily not only was a part of some of his most influential projects and pieces of furniture and buildings, and the work that was being done at Bauhaus School, but his legacy and all of these drawings that she personally saved, she doesn't get that credit for that. Eventually, her own studio is destroyed in the bombings during the war. She is eventually arrested by the Nazis. She's put into a forced labor camp. She's forced to work in the civil engineering department and doing, building things and designing things for the Nazis. Unfortunately, she survives the war, and starts to lecture on design and interior and building theory at the Berlin University of Arts. But she dies not soon thereafter, right after the war ends. So she does not have a very long illustrative career, unfortunately. But again, one of those unsung heroes, just because she was a woman and she couldn't excel in the way that her male partners could excel. And so she kind of has been left off of that narrative unfairly. So L is for Lily Reich. There we go. M is for minimal traditional. I'm definitely going to talk to you guys about minimal traditional right now, but I get into much more details about what minimal traditional is and the other residential architectural styles of, modern era in a lecture I did last year for MWNY, which is available on our YouTube. It was called Modern Living, I believe. And so you can go to that video and learn much, much more about minimal traditional and a couple of other architectural styles and types of buildings from this era. But the basics for minimal traditional, this is the star of World War II era residential housing. It is the little house that could. Minimal traditional was born from efficient house plans that were created by the Federal Housing Administration during the Great Depression. They recruited underworked architects and developers to help assist in designing, low cost, efficient, quality housing. Because, you have the Great Depression happening, no one's working, everything is horrible, and they're realizing how bad the everyday person's house is. So we need to design better ways to build houses so we don't have people living in, decrepit slum areas. And so that does a lot to help get quality, good housing during the Great Depression. But then once the World War II starts happening, then we're really in a housing shortage. And then after the war, with all the GIs coming home and everyone, getting married and having 18 babies, there's an incredible housing shortage. And so the minimal traditional really steps up and becomes the dominant example of residential style buildings being built. After the war, between 1946 and 1949, 3-year period, over 5.1 million homes were built, and the vast majority of them were these little minimal traditional style homes. They were created to be small, efficient houses just in general, but also so they could fit the parameters of the FHA loan program. So the entire mortgage program created by the FHA, after the world, from heading from war era to the post-war era, the loans were structured to perfectly pay, to pay the cost of building this house or buying one that was built on spec. So the whole entire financial aspect of that was built around everyone building this house and how much that would cost. It's not necessarily an architectural style, it's more a building typology, because you can then, decorate that the core of what a minimal traditional is and add different architectural styles. You can put some colonial revival things on it. You could put Tudor revival things, but essentially a minimal traditional home is going to be a small, usually 1-story house, 1.5 stories sometimes, with a low to intermediately pitched gabled roof. It's usually a side gabled, but you definitely see examples where they have, hipped roofs. As well. Just kind of think of like a little tiny Lego block, like a 4-prong Lego block. It's just a little tiny house. You have a living room, a kitchen, and bedrooms on the other side, a bathroom in the middle. Very basic, simple house. That middle ad that says there, "This is for us." It's one of those ads that came along in, advertising the FHA loan program, and that developers had to highlight the program. It is incredibly, and why I like this is because those people are white, right? And the phrase says, "This is for us." So it's not just about you as adults surviving the war, being promised this American dream of owning your own home, but it is impossible to look at the minimal traditional and this whole entire FHA loan program that was created for these houses, and not, you have to keep in mind how racism and white supremacy was part of it. These loan programs, utilized racist policies like redlining maps to dictate who could get loans and who could not get loans. If you could not get a loan, you couldn't get access to this minimal traditional style building, right? So while this definitely changes the landscape of America in this post-war period as an incredibly influential and is incredibly common, there is a very big divide between the people who access this American dream. White people had access to that, had the privilege of getting a minimal traditional. Most people of color did not have that ability. And that is M for minimal traditional. And now we are moving to N is for new formalism. New formalism is modernist, one of the few modernist styles that really tries to pull a lot more from the classical traditional style architecture. With new formalism, we see, it comes out in the 1950s and 1960s. You're using elements like columns and colonnades, entablatures. You're using the order of classical building and those elements, but you're using them in a completely modern way. You're not using heavy masonry and the heavy materials of the classical and traditional era, but you're making them now with metal. You're making them now with glass. You're using, more fancier types of marbles and clean colors and stuff like that. Nice, like international style meets classical architecture to a degree. New formalist buildings are definitely very symmetrical, again, taking that symmetry that we see in classical and traditional architecture, whereas most other modern styles love the asymmetrical. They want to be different for the sake of being different, and this wants that regular order that we see in the traditional architecture. So Edward Durrell Stone is kind of seen as the early developer. I wouldn't go as far as to say he's the father of New Formalism, because there's a bunch of people kind of doing it all at the same time. But he's definitely a leader in it, and it's his New Delhi American Embassy, which is that building here at the top, that horizontal building with the gold, that is seen as the symbolic start of New Formalism. Edward Durrell Stone, before he starts moving into this style of architecture, had been working primarily in kind of a brutalist place. Here in Buffalo, we have the Buffalo News building. That is an Edward Durrell Stone. Yeah, it sounded weird coming out of my mouth. That is, he designed that. It's a brutalist style building. So, he's working in that type of modern stuff, as well as when he's working in New Formalism. So he kind of flip-flops around in those styles, but there are other individuals that he's working with and influences that kind of stick with New Formalism. So that's kind of why I think he doesn't really have the full-on hat of being the father of New Formalism, because he did work in a couple of different aesthetics throughout his career. I think the biggest name other than Edward Durrell Stone when it comes to New Formalism is Minoru Yamasaki. And so he was the designer of Buffalo's own One M&T Plaza, which is that tall building on the left-hand side. While he was designing that building, he is also designing the World Trade Center, the original World Trade Center. Around the right-hand side, that lower picture is the Northwest National Life Bank in Minneapolis that he designed and built in 1965. So again, you can see in his work even more so how he's using those columns, he's using those colonnades, he's using that three-part idea of breaking up a building that is so very classical architecture idea, but he's using it with these modern streamlined materials. So really kind of bridging that gap and combining the old with the new. Edward Durrell Stone also designed the campus, the SUNY campus, SUNY Albany in Albany, New York. And so again, those two pictures of the Yamasaki buildings, that's pretty much what the campus at SUNY Albany looks like as well. So there, most New Formalist buildings have that same kind of nice crisp whiteness to them. That is N for New Formalism. O for organic. Organic architecture is the philosophy of architecture that promotes harmony between human habitation and the natural world. So we want this building to, we don't want to just plop this building in the middle of nature and have it be, contradictory to that nature around it. We don't want to, we want there to be harmony between this building and the nature. And so Falling Water on the right-hand side by Frank Lloyd Wright is obviously kind of the poster child of organic architecture. It's literally built into a waterfall cliff. The building responds to nature. And it's not just the shell of the building, the exterior of the building that has this relationship with the nature. But when we talk about organic architecture, it's also about the interior space. Every element of this building is going to be evaluated on its own, and to see how not only to have harmony with the outside and natural world, but harmony with each other. We want this to be an organic building that fits what you need it, how you want to use it, and how the nature evolves around it. So, we have that cantilevered house from the beginning, the stall house. It's built into the cliff. It has a cantilever thing to kind of fit on this rocky building, but the interior is like clean, stark, a different whole aesthetic. Whereas organic architecture, that interior is still going to mimic that feeling and that vibe that the natural environment around the building gives. Frank Lloyd Wright first used the term organic architecture himself in an article in Architectural Record in 1914. He wrote that quote, the idea of organic architecture is a sentient, rational building that would owe its style to the integrity with which it was individually fashioned to serve its particular purpose, a thinking as well as a feeling process. So again, it's just this every way in harmony with the nature and how you want to use that building. On the left-hand side is the Bravinger House, which was completed in 1955 in Oklahoma. It was designed by architect Bruce Goff. And again, it's considered, along with Falling Water and a couple other buildings, as a significant examples of organic architecture. It was awarded the 25-year award by the AIA in 1987. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but unfortunately in 2017, it was demolished. So that building does not exist anymore. I think that's something to keep in mind. And I think we've all heard about the issues that Falling Water has. Structural issues that go on there because it's built into this water, into this waterfall. That is something that happens to organic architecture. They're built into the nature. And while they were influenced, that architect was influenced by nature, they may not have built the building correctly to prevent nature from continuing to get into that building. They didn't take into account the changes that the nature would have and how that would impact. So you have a lot of, water infiltration and structural issues with a lot of these organic buildings that were built, out in the middle of nowhere in these picturesque natural environments. So that is O for organic. P for postmodernism. Postmodernism is also probably one of my, up there with futurism, my favorite architectural styles of all time. I love the camp of postmodernism, quite honestly. We'll talk about what that means. So again, the idea of modernism in general. Tia, are you talking? Oh, sorry. Never mind, excuse me. Postmodernism. So actual modernism, why, modernism evolves because we want to embrace form with function. We want to have our buildings to be influenced and resemble this modern era that we are in. And, Mies sets the tone by less is more. We don't want to have all of these extra decorative elements. We want smooth, streamlined buildings that just focus on that form and function. And that's what dominates the 1950s and 60s. But we get into the 70s and there are starting to be architects and designers out there that are like, no, I want design. I want the bells and whistles. I don't want to do the old architecture, the old classical and traditional stuff. I want to do something modern, but we need to have something else into there. We need more style in these buildings. We can't just have all of these simple glass and steel boxes. We need more variety and excitement. So that's where we kind of start seeing the road of modernism kind of go into brutalism and then into postmodernism. Brutalism has kind of a shorter blip on the timeline of architecture. And it's postmodernism that kind of takes us into the, ends through the 20th into the 21st century as kind of that dominant modernist style, especially in large, commercial and public buildings. The de facto leaders of postmodernism were the married couple and business partners Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi. His 1966 book, Complexity and Contradiction, Venturi argued against the steel and glass boxes of the previous era and was calling for a return to more eclectic architecture. And then those basic principles of the style were then reinforced in their joint book, along with Stephen Isnor in 1972 called Learning from Las Vegas. That is required reading in most preservation schools. And so they go through and explain what this postmodernism is and outlining these principles from their point of view. Postmodernism has a lot of examples in it and it's a very broad style and is either just ending or is still happening. So we're just so close to these buildings being built that we really don't have nice firm definition of what postmodernism is. But based on the Venturi and Brown's writings and other key leaders of the movement, we kind of have these four general qualities that postmodernist buildings need to play with and participate in. And so those qualities are complexity, contradiction, fragmentation, and camp. So again, while Mies and the leaders of modernism in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s were talking about less is more, Venturi countered by saying less is a bore. So we want buildings that have complex aspects to it. We want contradictions in our buildings. We want fragmentations. We want bright colors. We want camp. Camp, again, that's kind of why I love postmodernism. The goofiness of it. Camp is defined, who defined it? Defined by Susan Sontag in 1964 as being something that's so bad it's good. And I just love that about these buildings. It's comical. They're taking these elements that are from classical and traditional styles, but redoing them with modern things and grouping them in weird, goofy ways. I think my favorite example of that is that top skyscraper you see on the right-hand side. That is 505 Madison Avenue. It was formerly called the AT&T building in New York City, designed by Philip Johnson. It has that huge, broken pediment as the roof. Now that element, that broken pediment, you would see that on colonial style buildings, classical style buildings, above a doorway, above a window. You definitely see it incorporated into cornice lines and roof lines, but to have it be the entire freaking roof of this skyscraper, that's goofy, man. That's to the extreme, right? On the left-hand side, that blue house is actually the Vanna Venturi house. Robert designed it for his mother. It was built 1962 to 64. It's located in a neighborhood outside of in Philadelphia, excuse me. Again, it's using modern materials, this modern aesthetic, but also kind of trying to call and utilize these elements from classical and traditional architecture. A local example, there are a good number of postmodernist examples, but again, because we're still in this era, I'm not sure if we're kind of calling all of them postmodern yet, but one that I feel confident calling postmodern is this Bert Flickinger Athletic Center. It was designed by HHL Architects. You can see that bright use of color, very quintessential of postmodernist architecture, the exposed red framing there. You have contrasting asymmetrical form, you have glass, you have masonry elements, again, complexity and contradiction. The left-hand side is the Portland building by Michael Graves. It was built in 1982. Michael Graves is my favorite postmodernist architect. His work is definitely more on the camp side and the fanciful, kind of exaggerated side. He did a lot of buildings for Disney, for the Disney company. Again, kind of using these elements of camp and exaggerated elements to build these buildings. He built the Denver Public Library, which kind of looks like different shapes and building blocks stacked on top of each other. We actually, in the office, he designed later in his career, he did a lot of houseware elements and partnered with different stores and stuff to design interior elements and items. And so we at the office actually have one of the phones that Michael Graves, like a desk phone that Michael Graves designed for Target like a million years ago. And so it looks like an old school rotary phone, but it kind of also looks like it could be something from the movie Toys. It was a early 90s movie with Robin Williams where his dad owned a toy company, and it's a very funny, weird movie. That whole movie is postmodern. And so if you've seen that movie, you know what I'm talking about. And this phone that Michael Graves designed for Target definitely looks like it would be on one of the desks of the people working in that toy company. And that is P for postmodern. Oops, there we go. And now Q for questions, because quite honestly, I could not think of a Q word to save my life. So I don't know if anyone has a Q modernist word that they want to share, or Tia, if there's any questions or comments you want to bring up. I will take your silence as an, oh no, you came back. Tia. Hello? Okay, no. All right, so no questions then. Let us go on with the rest of the alphabet. So R for ranches. Again, ranches, we cover that in the lecture we did last year that's available on our YouTube page. the Modern Living lecture. So I won't go into a bunch of details on ranches, but so we have minimal traditional, which is that first style, the types of houses that are being built for those first generation of FHA loans. Those minimal traditionals are being purchased and lived in by returning GIs and their new wives, and they are their starter homes. They, you know, either have 1 or 2 kids, or they haven't had kids yet. Like, that is the starter home. Getting us through that immediate post-war era. Then by the time ranches start developing, it's because those families have grown, because we've survived and are now entering into these, you know, swinging 50s and 60s, where we have this huge expansion of the middle class. We have the baby boom happening. We want these larger houses. We have more suburbs being developed. So instead of needing to have a minimal traditional that fits on a traditional, you know, small urban lot, or, you know, first ring suburb lot, we now can have, you know, communities with much larger lots. And so we can have these long, exaggerated buildings on those lots. When in the time period, they were also known as ramblers. They were known for their open floor plans and modern stylings. Again, we don't need to, by now, in this time period, we don't need to live in the small little Victorian rooms of the previous era so that we can control our heat and cooling. Now we have the technology where we can have a big, any normal middle class person could have this big expansive house and be able to heat and cool it efficiently. Ranches are definitely on the fence, just like minimal traditional, as being a style versus typology. You can definitely dress up your ranch style home to be more mid-century. You could style it to be more, you know, colonial revival, Tudor revival, but essentially, as long as it is a long ranch, elongated building, usually divided into 3 parts. You have one part where it's the private spaces, the bedroom side. You have the middle section where usually the door is, and that's where the public rooms, you know, public rooms for the house, the living room, the dining room, those types of spaces. And then you have the garage. Ranches have that built-in garage to them. They also, while having those kind of open spaces on the interior, most ranches also then incorporate the exterior in some degree. So having, you know, a large patio that you just kind of, that naturally grows out of the house in the backyard. You know, more high style, expensive examples of ranches might even have, you know, in ground pools, you know, indoor pools, and having kind of this hybrid interior exterior natural space as well. I included on the right hand side is the Lincoln Homes ads. I include that every time I talk about ranches because their whole thing was that they named them after women. They gave them women names, and depending on the jazziness of the name, you know, directly related to the jazziness of the house, right? So like Patricia, kind of an old normal name, Patricia, she, you know, whatever. And so it's just like a normal ranch. And then Heather has like a fancier ranch, and there's other names, like there's so many other ones that have women's names. There's one that's called Marge, and it's like even plainer than Patricia. So I just really love the Lincoln Homes, really kind of, you know, a beautiful mix of architecture and misogyny all in one. If you want to learn more about ranches, this little picture up here at the top, the guidelines evaluation, the ranch house in Georgia. Georgia is one of the first states to really do, and they did a comprehensive survey of ranch houses and styles that they find in Georgia. And so they have this really great guide kind of detailing the history and timeline and evolution of ranches in Georgia. And it's incredibly interesting. I don't think that many other states, and certainly we haven't here in New York, have really done that kind of level of survey and research on these mid-century types of buildings. All right, that is R for ranches. We got S for Eero Saarinen. Eero Saarinen. He was a Finnish-born American architect who was, again, one of the leaders in the trend towards exploration and experimentation in American architecture during the 1950s and into the 60s. He was the son of a noted architect in his own right, Elian Saarinen, and then his mother was Loja Gellius. Not really great at pronouncing these Scandinavian names. She was a textile designer and sculptor in her own right. His father was known for his Art Deco designs, right? And he was, you know, a very prominent architect for that first half of the 20th century. They moved to the United States in the 20s. Arrow starts first studying sculpture, but he later says that, he never thought about, he always knew that he was going to follow his father in line. So he went to architecture school. He starts his own practice in doing some research on housing and city planning with the Flint Institute of Research and Planning in Flint, Michigan in 1936. But then in 1938, he joins his father's firm and they work together. When we look at the examples of Arrow's architecture, there's definitely variety in it. He has a style and he has a thumbprint to some degree, but he also, to speak to his skill, he was very good at not just creating this artistic design that he had, but really kind of listening and understanding what that client wanted and what the space needed to be for itself. And so that's why I kind of included the 3 building examples that you see on the screen. Obviously, the bottom is Kleinhans here in the city of Buffalo that he designed with his father in 1940. It's the music hall. And then the local architects that worked with them on it were F.J. and W.A. Kidd. And the building is designed to look like a stringed instrument, right? So you kind of see that influence to it and have that very, 1940s time period of mid-century modern there. The building up on the top right with that kind of blue hole in the middle, that is a chapel that he designed on the MIT campus. That building has no windows. The only opening is that perfectly circular skylight above the altar. A metal sculpture dangles from the window, reflecting intense light into the otherwise dark enclosed brick cylinder. The chapel was designed to serve all faiths and is an intensely focused and celebratory worship space. So again, listening, it's a complete departure from the type of mid-century modern that we see with the Kleinhans and the theory of why Kleinhans, the whole reason of why it's shaped the way. And then here really kind of listening to what does this chapel need? It has to be for all faiths. It needs to be this contemplative space and kind of really playing on what that client and what that building needs to be and not necessarily focusing on his own need for that building to be a certain way or whatnot. And then we have the TWA terminal at JFK. This was actually completed after he died, after his death in 1961. So it's one of his most, famous pieces, and unfortunately he didn't even get to see it finished. It's the shape of a compact bird embodying the 1960s sense of fantasy and science fiction. But so it definitely has, it's a working terminal. It was an airport terminal. So it definitely needed to meet those functional needs of the terminal, but also wanting to meet the needs of this emerging jet set elite that would be using this space. Even the utilitarian parts, even those, servant spaces, the hallways and connection areas, even all of those were kind of designed to emulate this luxurious bridge of a spaceship. And we all probably, most of you have seen and know by now that it was abandoned. It was threatened for many, many years, but it has been recently rehabilitated and is now a very swanky, fancy hotel that maybe one day I'll be able to go if this pandemic ever ends. One of his most famous commissions. He, like I said, started in sculpture before coming back to architecture. While he definitely, worked full-time as an architect, he never left sculpture design and material design. And so you can see there are the 2 chairs that he designed during his lifetime. That red chair, that white and red chair is the tulip chair. And then the wound chair next to it, again, along with the Eames's chairs and certainly Mies's chairs that he designed with Lily. These are kind of quintessential mid-century modern. These chairs defined, helped to define interior design of this era. And that is S for Eero Saarinen. Excellent. T for terracotta. So this is kind of like this is kind of a stretch right now. So terracotta, obviously it's a building material that we've been using since the beginning of time. It translates to literally cooked earth. Why do we see terracotta being used in buildings? It's because it's cheap, it's fast, and it's fireproof. So when we have the Gilded Age going into the early 1900s, we just have this explosion of the use of architectural terracotta. Because we have a ton of money and we can build a lot of buildings with a lot of, we can add, you want to create buildings that have lots of architectural detailings on the outside to kind of show off all this money that's being raised by these developers and building owners during the Gilded Age. But we want to do it fast and cheap because we want to keep more of that money. We don't want to put all our money into that building. And so terracotta allowed for that. It allows, as our terracotta walking tour video, as I said a couple of years ago in that, it's the perfect meeting of durability. It's a long-lasting material, but it allows you to create these very detailed and intricate exteriors. We see terracotta being used, in the guarantee building detail that you see on the left-hand side. So that first generation of skyscrapers, that first generation of downtown shopping centers and department stores, so many of those are covered in terracotta. And again, because of that fireproof aspect, it helps kind of create the beginning of what a modern downtown is going to look like. Terracotta then kind of goes away because we start using glass and metal to build our skyscrapers, and not like Louis Sullivan covering the entire thing in terracotta tiles. So terracotta kind of goes through a sleepy period for a while, but now in this new era of modernism and going into the future, terracotta is definitely coming back and is being used, not quite as much as the turn of the century in the 1900s, but is definitely having a revival. The UB Jacobs School of Medicine downtown is a great example of this new generation of terracotta architecture. And we here in Western New York are definitely spoiled in a way, or have a front seat to this new era of terracotta, because Boston Valley Terracotta is located here, and they are, one of the leading providers of architectural terracotta in the world. I definitely encourage you to head over to their website and take a look at the new projects that they're doing. They certainly do tons of restoration projects. They worked on the restoration of the terracotta of the Guarantee building, but again, they are kind of creating this revolutionary path forward of how to use terracotta for this new generation of architecture. And that is T for terracotta. U for urban renewal. So again, we can't have, not everything in the modernist era was hunky-dory, with the minimal traditionals and the FHA loans. There's definitely this aspect of racism and white supremacy that is just ingrained in that program, and who gets to have and access and live in those types of communities. And we see the same thing here with urban renewal. Urban renewal is the clearing out of blighted areas in an inner city. It's clearing out slums to create opportunities for a higher class of housing, a better class of housing and building, office structures, businesses, and more. It seems like a good idea, right? We got these neighborhoods that are completely run down. We need to give them better conditions. So let's get rid of that and build new. But as it actually was executed and rolled out, whether intentional or not, we can look back on those urban renewal projects and recognize that they just perpetuated and expanded those racist and classist financial and development practices, and actively looked to kind of disenfranchise and frankly remove people of color and people of lower socioeconomic statuses from these downtown urban environments. It was prioritizing the value of that land over the people who were living there. So how does that work out? That works out by, you have a whole big neighborhood of substandard buildings, residential buildings, commercial buildings. We demolish that entire neighborhood and we replace it with a public housing project that is a smaller footprint than what was originally torn down. And so in effect, warehousing all of these individuals into this public housing so that you can then use that remaining land to kind of build this grand modern spaces to meet the existing needs for government and business spaces, but also to create the next generation of cultural institutions and community spaces. again, it is incredibly important to understand that whether intentional or not, these urban renewal projects are most likely or are being geared to attract and meet the needs of all of those white people that fled the city, that participated in that white flight, that allowed and perpetuated and created the situation where people of color and lower socioeconomic statuses were living in these slum conditions. So these new urban renewal spaces is kind of giving them this new clean downtown that they can work in, shop in, have entertainment in, but then be able to leave and go back to their suburban areas. On the right-hand side, you can see this map that was included in a report that was produced in 1971-72, showing the areas that were being studied for urban renewal. The neighborhoods that had execution, had completed projects, and then were planning for. And again, those are, if you lined up that map with a redlining map, it is the same neighborhoods that were redlined. It's the neighborhoods of poor people and people of color that were prevented from accessing those financial incentives to be able to improve their buildings on their own. And so then those are the same neighborhoods. You're punishing them a second time. You didn't let them get the money. So now you're going to tear down their neighborhoods and replace it with what you think should go there. So again, really the brunt of this urban renewal was borne by people of color and lower socioeconomics. There's also, I think that we can all name some urban renewal projects that are good, that ended up very successful in the end. It's sad to think about the buildings that were torn down and the people that were displaced when they were built, but now it is something that you can't imagine your city without. But as many of those are there's even more that were just failures. And so the Main Place Mall, I think we can all agree, was a failure of urban renewal. There's many reasons, complicated overlapping reasons of why it's a failure, but it's definitely a failure. Up in Niagara Falls, which you'll learn all about, way more about this Saturday on our walking tour. The Rainbow Center, again, this kind of pipe dream of urban renewal, creating this new vision of what downtown could be, and just wasn't successful. And so not only do we fail in these projects and have the burden of that loss, but we did these failures at the expense of some amazing original architecture that could have been rehabilitated, that could have still be standing today. That is urban renewal. Obviously, this is like the shortest version of urban renewal. It is much more complicated than what I just talked about, and I highly encourage you to go read more about it. All right, V is for Blanche Lemko Van Ginkel. Her maiden name is Lemko. She married a Van Ginkel, so that is the name she went by. They actually worked together, I believe. So Blanche was born in 1923. She's a Canadian architect and city planner. She mostly worked in Montreal and Toronto. And she is known for her modernist designs as well as her work on the Expo 67, and was one of the key people that spearheaded the preservation of old Montreal. That was originally going to be torn down as part of the Expo and other development things, and she was quite influential in preserving that area. She went, she's from Canada. She went to McGill, got her architecture, studied at McGill. And then after World War II, there's just like in America, there's this need for housing, and we do the whole FHA loan thing and all that jazz. In the rest of the world, there's a housing shortage. I mean, where they actually fought the war and they had bombs, they needed to rebuild the cities that were ruined by that war. And so there was this large scale project by Le Corbusier called the Unité Habitation in Marseille. I can't speak today, and I even speak French. Sorry, y'all. So again, it was this multi-family residential housing project for the people of Marseille that were dislocated from the bombings in France. So it was kind of this project, this experiment in how to create this new multi-use housing project. And Le Corbusier invited Blanche to be a part of that. And so she got to work with him on that project. And then she came back to Canada so that exposes her to this whole idea of modernist concepts and designs. And then she brings that back to Canada. She continues her studies at McGill, graduates with a degree in city planning, continues her studies at McGill, and then goes to Harvard for a degree in city planning in 1950. In 1952, she goes back to Canada. She becomes a registered architect. She is only the 4th woman to be a registered architect in all of Canada in the 1950s. She starts her firm in 1957, and again, it's known for buildings, for architecture, but also for city planning projects. And so she is the lead designer and kind of the chair of the committee that ends up planning Expo 67, which is what that map is in the middle. If anyone's familiar with old Montreal, the downtown, the World's Fair happens in 1967 in Montreal, and it's her firm that is kind of leading that charge to create the planning for that whole entire thing. And then she just spends her entire career in Canada, Montreal and Toronto. She is a very, she reaches the kind of the tops of the top of architecture world in Canada. Again, like I said, she was only the 4th registered female architect in the country. She subsequently became the first woman elected as a council member of the Provence, Quebec's Association of Architects, like their version of the AIA. She's the first woman elected as an officer to the Royal Architectural Institute in Canada. She's the first woman and first Canadian to serve as the president of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. She was the dean of the University of Toronto, and she was the first woman to hold that position at a Canadian School of Architecture. She wrote tons of books, very, very known in Canada, and she deserves much more notoriety. That is her, that photograph of her in the dress, that's her with Le Corbusier in Marseille on site at the project. As part of that project, she was, her role was designing the roof of the big apartment complex of this big building. And that's what this picture here is on the right-hand side. She talks quite, she did write a lot about her work and theory of architecture and stuff like that. And so again, because she came from the city planning background in designing the roof, all elements of the roof, not just the spaces that were going to be used by people, but also where the mechanical elements went, everything that had to do with this roof, she really did kind of do it systematically, thinking, are people going to use this? How does it need to function? And then how can we make it beautiful and match with the rest of the building? So again, I think that's a common theme with all the women that we've talked about this evening, that they are looking for a more holistic approach to this modern architecture, which I definitely enjoy. That is V for Van Ginkel, Blanche. W for Frank Lloyd Wright. I mean, we got to talk about him, right? I mean, he is kind of, we have modernism in America because of him, I guess. That's what they say. We always talk about him. He's always there, but I couldn't really think of anything else funner to write for W. And again, he is so important in the evolution and development of modernism. He himself might not be technically defined as a modernist. I mean, he definitely built some very emblematic modernist buildings, the Guggenheim as such, but his whole theory and vision of what architecture should and can be, really does set the field for how modernism develops into the future. So that's all I want to say about Frank Lloyd Wright. We all know about him. The pictures you see in front of you, that blurry one that I didn't realize was that pixelated when I made the presentation, that is Unity Temple in Chicago. It was designed by Wright in 1905 to 1908. It's considered to be one of Wright's most important structures, dating from the first decade of the 20th century in his early work. And then on the right-hand side is the Ennis House. It's a private residence in LA. He designed it for Charles and Mabel Ennis in 1923, 24. And it's built of these textile blocks, these interlocking textile blocks. And so he, you know, not only pushed the envelope in the designs of, you know, the actual design of the buildings, but he definitely tried to look for interesting and different ways to actually physically complete and construct those buildings. The Ennis House is listed as a National Historic Landmark as well. And it's owned by billionaire Ronald Burkle. So that's fun. It's also featured in a lot of different movies and stuff, but Frank Lloyd Wright, again, kind of just laying that groundwork with his whole entire theory, kind of setting the stage for most American modernists to follow him. X is for expositions. Again, kind of a stretch alphabetically speaking. Expositions, world fairs, whatever we want to call them, they have played a significant role in the advancement and evolution of design, art, and architecture around the world. I mean, that's the whole point of them, is to come and, you know, exhibit what new technologies, new things each country is doing, what's happening around the world, and to learn and share from them. I mean, not just when we're talking about art and design and architecture and all that jazz, but also when it comes to food too. I mean, we wouldn't have my 3 favorite food groups, the club sandwich, cotton candy, and ice cream cones, if it wasn't for world fairs and expositions. So very great places to share knowledge and, you know, key things of architecture have happened at world expositions. The Great Exposition of 1851 in London gives us the Crystal Palace, this big, massive glass and steel structure that just was, you know, revolutionary for 1851. The World's Columbia Exposition in Chicago in 1893, that gives us the White City and kind of sets forth the example for how all cities should be planned and organized. The Panama, California Exposition in 1915 is where the world is introduced and sees Spanish Revival architecture. The International Exhibit of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts in Paris is where we get Art Deco from. So again, very important. The 2 that are really influential to modern architecture, the World's Fair 1964 in New York, and then Expo 67 in Montreal. So the World's Fair in New York, it's in Flushing Meadow Corona Park in Queens. And again, it's the showcase of mid-20th century culture and technology. It really, really, you know, focuses on the space age and you know, that type of mid-century style. It's heavily influenced by Googie architecture and futurist, tons of exhibits from all around the world. You know, most of the buildings were temporary, but there are some of those buildings that are still standing in Corona Park and which are now listed on the National Register, if not only also National Historic Landmarks, I believe. And then Expo 67, again, we had Blanche was working on that to help us design and lay out that area. It was the largest and most successful expo actually as well. So that's fun to say with over, it also set the single day attendance record for any World's Fair with 500,000 visitors on its third day. 500,000 people walked through that on its third day. My mother is Canadian. My mother was born in Montreal. She has very fun memories of going to the expo. And, you know, if you lived in Montreal, you had like a deal on tickets. And so they would go. So I've heard a lot about it. That picture that you see there is the United States Pavilion that was designed by Buckminster Fuller, another major player in modernist architecture. Most of that is still there, as well as a couple of buildings, but again, a lot of them were temporary, just like with other World's Fairs. One of the permanent structures was Habitat 67, which was built on the water. It's just, you know, these buildings out here kind of, and it's a brutalist style building. It's concrete blocks, and it's just all these blocks on top of each other. And it was to show kind of, you know, a revolutionary way to build houses, this brutalist style. It was retained and it was actually used as housing for the Olympics that Montreal hosted later in the 70s. I forget what year exactly that was. We are running out of time. Y is for Yale Art and Architecture Building, designed by Paul Rudolph. Paul Rudolph, again, major player, major architect in modernist style, primarily working in you know, his large public buildings were primarily brutalist in style, but he definitely, when he was working in Florida and part of the Sarasota School of Architecture, you know, more of a mid-century contemporary vibe going on with those buildings. We hear are lucky enough in Western New York to have had several of his designs. The only one still standing is the Public Library in Niagara Falls. His other works were either demolished, the shoreline, or not fully realized with the continued plan that he had for the waterfront over there. With this building, the Yale Art and Architecture building, he was a professor there, and so was working there. So that's kind of how he got in to get it. This design was directly influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright's Larkin Administration Building here in Buffalo. So again, a lot of connections between Paul Rudolph and us here in Buffalo. During the time, the height of his career in that late 60s, early 70s, he was arguably, one of the most famous, recognizable architects in America. There are many covers of magazines with his face on it. And, one of the featuring his buildings, but he didn't really write a lot about him, and there weren't a lot of pieces on him. He didn't really want people to talk about him. He didn't want people to do cover stories on him. And so there's really one of the few that is written about him is called Enigmas of Architecture. It was written in 1977, and it kind of goes into the theory of his architectural practice and whatnot. And that is cool dude him sitting on a couch all dapper looking. And to end, Z for Zaha Hadid. She was a British Iraqi architect. She passed away recently in 2016, unfortunately. She was born in Iraq. She studied mathematics as an undergraduate degree and then went on to study architecture. She's referred to as the queen of the curve. You can see here by her dramatic, almost emotional buildings. Very expressive structures. She loved to liberate architectural geometry, giving it a whole new expression and identity. The middle picture is the London Aquatic Center that was built for the Olympics. What are the other buildings here? The sharp one that has like the heartbeat on top of it is the Riverside Museum. It's an addition to the Glasgow Museum of Transport in Scotland. And then the building underneath her photo is the Haydar Alevi Center in Azerbaijan. I can't speak today. That is clad in reinforced concrete and polyester. So again, you kind of see that dramatic curve that she was known for. And with that, that is the whole alphabet. Questions, comments? How are you?
We do have one question.
Yes.
Which is, what architectural program was Charles Eames asked to leave?
I do not remember. And I remember when I saw that fact in 2 different books, they didn't even mention it in the sentence. So we'll have to have somebody Google it quick, because I can't Google and have the presentation open at the same time. I feel like maybe someone is typing something right now, but that is an answer I do not have. Any other questions to you?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, sorry. All right, well, that is it, everybody. Thank you so much for participating and attending tonight. Filled in the whole entire 2 hours. I did spell Lloyd wrong, I'm sorry. Yes, it was in Bangladesh, that Louis Khan building that I wrote down wrong. It was the Parliament building in Bangladesh. It was sort of built with a moat around it. Very, very interesting building. Thank you, Elaine, for catching that. Again, just meant to be a fun kind of introduction to a bunch of different modernism things. Have a great night, everybody, and we'll see you at the next event. Oh, Washington University, St. Louis. Thank you, Lorna. All right, good night, everybody.